When they pulled the rope tight around Thomas McKinnon's neck on that gray morning in 1879, everyone expected to hear the snap that would end his life. Instead, they heard something that defied everything they knew about Hangman's knots. The rope unraveled like it was made of smoke. What the people of Copper Ridge didn't know was that rope maker Ezra Whitman had been weaving impossible escapes into every strand he sold, and his knots were saving more than just condemned men. But to understand how a simple craftsman became the most dangerous threat to corrupt justice in Colorado territory, we need to go back to where it all started. Back to a winter night in 1867, when Ezra Whitman witnessed an execution that would change everything he believed about right, wrong, and the delicate art of making rope. Ezra Whitman had arrived in Copper Ridge in the autumn of 1865 as a young man with calloused hands, a sharp mind, and the specialized skills needed to provide frontier communities with the ropes that held their world together. At 26 years old, Ezra possessed knowledge of cordage making that was rare in the Western Territories, techniques passed down through generations of Scottish rope makers who had supplied ships, mills, and construction projects throughout the British Isles. The skills that Ezra brought to Colorado territory were more than just practical craftsmanship. He understood the mathematical relationships between fiber tension, twist patterns, and load-bearing capacity that allowed him to create ropes that were stronger, more durable, and more reliable than anything most frontier communities had ever seen. His lasso ropes helped cowboys control the wildest cattle. His climbing ropes allowed miners to descend safely into the deepest shafts, and his rigging ropes kept wagons and buildings secure against the fierce winds that swept across the prairie. But it was Ezra's work creating Hangman's nooses that would eventually define his legacy and transform him from a respected craftsman into something far more complex and dangerous. Copper Ridge in the 1860s was a rough mining town where justice was swift, brutal, and often administered by men who cared more about maintaining order than ensuring fairness. The territorial court system was overwhelmed by the volume of cases generated by a rapidly growing population of miners, cowboys, gamblers, and drifters who brought their conflicts and criminal activities to a place where law enforcement resources were limited and legal proceedings were simplified out of necessity. Public hangings were common events in Copper Ridge, serving both as punishment for convicted criminals and as entertainment for residents who had few other diversions available in their harsh frontier environment. The quality of the rope used for these executions was considered crucial. A poorly made noose could result in a slow, agonizing death that would be traumatic for spectators and inhumane for the condemned, while a rope that broke during the execution would be seen as a sign of divine intervention that might complicate the administration of justice. Ezra's reputation for creating perfect hangman's nooses was established early in his career, when a sheriff of Copper Ridge commissioned him to make ropes for a series of executions that had been scheduled for the winter of 1866. The first noose that Ezra crafted worked exactly as intended. The condemned man died quickly and cleanly, with none of the prolonged suffering that sometimes characterized frontier hangings. The sheriff was so impressed with Ezra's work that he made him the exclusive supplier of execution ropes for Copper Ridge and the surrounding mining camps. For nearly 2 years, Ezra fulfilled these grim commissions without questioning the justice of the sentences he was helping to carry out. He approached the work with the same professional detachment that he brought to all of his rope-making projects, focusing on the technical requirements of creating a noose that would function reliably rather than dwelling on the human consequences of his craftsmanship. But everything changed on the night of December 15th, 1867, when Ezra witnessed an execution that revealed the dark corruption underlying Copper Ridge's justice system. The condemned man was Patrick O'Sullivan, an Irish immigrant miner who had been convicted of murdering a claim jumper named William Hayes in a dispute over mining rights. O'Sullivan had maintained his innocence throughout his trial, claiming that Hayes had been killed by claim jumpers working for a powerful mining syndicate that wanted to eliminate small independent miners and consolidate control over the richest deposits in the area. The evidence against O'Sullivan had been circumstantial at best. He had been found near Hayes' body with blood on his clothes and a mining pick in his hands, but several witnesses had testified that O'Sullivan had been trying to help the wounded man rather than attacking him. More troubling, the prosecution's case had relied heavily on testimony from men who were known to be associates of the mining syndicate that O'Sullivan claimed was responsible for Hayes' death. Despite these concerns, O'Sullivan had been convicted by a jury that included several men with financial ties to the mining syndicate, and Judge Morrison had sentenced him to death by hanging. The execution was scheduled for dawn on December 16th, 1867, and Ezra had been commissioned to provide the rope that would carry out the sentence. But on the night before the execution, Ezra overheard a conversation that changed everything he thought he knew about Patrick O'Sullivan's case. He was working late in his shop, finishing preparations for the next morning's grim ceremony, when he heard voices coming from the alley behind his building. Sheriff Brady was talking with two men that Ezra recognized as associates of mine owner Marcus Blackwood, the leader of the syndicate that controlled most of the valuable claims in the area. What Ezra heard in that alley was a detailed confession of O'Sullivan's innocence and a celebration of the syndicate's success in using the legal system to eliminate a troublesome witness. William Hayes hadn't been killed by O'Sullivan. He had been murdered by Blackwood's men because he had discovered evidence of the syndicate's illegal activities, including claim jumping, mine sabotage, and the murder of several other independent miners who had refused to sell their claims at below-market prices. O'Sullivan's only crime had been arriving at the scene of Hayes' murder while the Real killers were still present. They had beaten him unconscious and planted evidence to make him appear guilty, then used their influence over local officials to ensure his conviction and execution. With O'Sullivan dead, the last witness to their crimes would be silenced forever, and the syndicate could continue operating without fear of exposure. The conversation that Ezra overheard also revealed the extent of the corruption that had infected Copper Ridge's legal system. Sheriff Brady was on Blackwood's payroll, as were several members of the jury that had convicted O'Sullivan, the prosecutor who had built the case against him, and Judge Morrison who had sentenced him to death. The entire proceeding had been orchestrated by the mining syndicate to eliminate a threat to their illegal operations. Ezra was faced with an impossible choice. He could speak out about what he had learned, but doing so would put his own life in danger and might not be enough to save O'Sullivan from execution. The corrupt officials who controlled Copper Ridge's legal system would simply deny his accusations and proceed with the hanging as planned. Alternatively, he could remain silent and allow an innocent man to die, knowing that his rope would be the instrument of a judicial murder orchestrated by criminals who had perverted the legal system for their own purposes. But Ezra's years of working with ropes had taught him that sometimes the most effective solutions were the ones that operated through subtle manipulation rather than direct confrontation. He had learned to solve complex engineering problems by understanding the hidden properties of materials and using those properties in ways that weren't immediately obvious to casual observers. Perhaps the same approach could be applied to saving Patrick O'Sullivan's life without directly challenging the corrupt officials who were determined to see him dead. That night, Ezra began developing the technique that would define the rest of his career and transform him from a simple craftsman into one of the most effective opponents of frontier corruption in American history. He would learn to weave salvation into every strand of rope he made, creating nooses that appeared normal but contained hidden mechanisms that would save the lives of condemned men, while exposing the injustices that had led to their sentences. The key to Ezra's innovation was his deep understanding of rope construction and the physics of hanging. A proper hangman's noose was designed to break the condemned person's neck quickly and cleanly through the sudden stop created when the rope reached its full extension. But Ezra realized that he could modify the internal structure of his ropes in ways that would cause them to behave differently under the extreme stresses of an execution. By varying the twist patterns in different sections of the rope, introducing deliberately weak points at specific locations, and incorporating materials that would degrade under tension, Ezra could create nooses that would appear perfect to casual inspection but would fail in predictable ways when subjected to the forces generated during a hanging. The result would be a rope that would unravel, break, or stretch just enough to prevent the condemned person from dying while creating the impression that divine intervention or supernatural forces were at work. But Ezra's technique went beyond simply saving lives through mechanical sabotage. He also learned to embed coded messages in the construction of his ropes, patterns of knots, variations in thickness, and arrangements of different colored fibers that could convey information to people who knew how to read them. These coded ropes could carry evidence of corruption, reveal the identities of real criminals, or provide instructions for exposing the injustices that had led to wrongful convictions. The execution of Patrick O'Sullivan on December 16, 1867, was the first test of Ezra's revolutionary approach to fighting corruption through rope making. The noose that he had prepared looked identical to every other hangman's rope he had ever made, but contained modifications that would prevent it from functioning as intended while providing evidence of O'Sullivan's innocence to anyone who knew how to interpret the coded information woven into its strands. When the trapdoor opened beneath O'Sullivan's feet, the rope appeared to tighten around his neck exactly as it should have. But instead of delivering the sudden, fatal shock that everyone expected, the rope began to unravel in a controlled sequence that Ezra had engineered to unfold over the course of several minutes. To the spectators watching the execution, it appeared that the rope was mysteriously losing its integrity, as if supernatural forces were intervening to save an innocent man. As the rope continued to unravel, it revealed hidden elements that Ezra had woven into its core, colored threads arranged in patterns that spelled out names, dates, and locations related to the real circumstances of William Hay's murder. For anyone who understood Ezra's coding system, the disintegrating rope was providing a detailed account of the mining syndicate's criminal activities and the corruption that had led to O'Sullivan's wrongful conviction. The crowd's reaction to O'Sullivan's miraculous survival was immediate and dramatic. Many spectators interpreted the rope's failure as a sign that God was protecting an innocent man, while others suspected that human intervention rather than divine providence was responsible for the execution's failure. Most importantly, several people in the crowd were able to read the coded messages that Ezra had embedded in the rope, and they began spreading information about the real circumstances of William Hay's death. But the most significant reaction came from Patrick O'Sullivan himself. As he recovered from his near-death experience, he found himself holding pieces of the rope that had failed to kill him, and those pieces contained detailed instructions for exposing the mining syndicate's crimes and the corruption that had pervaded Copper Ridge's legal system. The information that O'Sullivan received through Ezra's coded rope led to a series of revelations that completely transformed the political and economic landscape of Copper Ridge. With Ezra's guidance, O'Sullivan was able to gather evidence of the mining syndicate's illegal activities, document the corruption of local officials, and build a case for federal intervention and territorial law enforcement. The federal investigation that followed O'Sullivan's survival revealed the existence of a criminal conspiracy that had been operating in Colorado territory for over 5 years. Marcus Blackwood and his associates were arrested on charges of murder, fraud, and corruption, while Sheriff Brady, Judge Morrison, and several other officials were removed from office and prosecuted for their roles in perverting the legal system. But Ezra's work was just beginning. The success of his rope-based intervention in O'Sullivan's case had demonstrated the potential for using his craftsmanship skills to fight corruption and save innocent lives throughout the frontier. Over the following years, he would refine his techniques and expand his operations to become one of the most effective opponents of judicial corruption in the Western Territories. The pattern was always the same. Ezra would learn about a questionable conviction or a corrupt legal proceeding, investigate the circumstances surrounding the case, and then create a specially modified rope that would save the condemned person's life while providing evidence of the injustices that had led to their sentence. His ropes became legendary throughout Colorado Territory and beyond, with stories spreading about the mysterious craftsman whose nooses seemed to have minds of their own and whose failures always coincided with revelations of corruption and wrongdoing. But Ezra's activities eventually attracted the attention of people who had good reasons to want his rope-based interventions to stop. Corrupt officials, criminal organizations, and powerful business interests throughout the Western Territories began to realize that their illegal activities were being exposed and their plans disrupted by a rope maker whose craftsmanship was anything but ordinary. The first serious attempt to stop Ezra's work came in 1872, when a group of corrupt officials in New Mexico Territory conspired to eliminate him before he could interfere with their plans to execute a whistleblower who had gathered evidence of their criminal activities. They hired professional assassins to kill Ezra and destroy his workshop, hoping to end his rope-based interventions permanently. But Ezra had anticipated that his activities would eventually make him a target, and he had developed countermeasures that went far beyond his rope-making skills. He had established a network of allies throughout the Western Territories: federal law enforcement officials, honest judges, reform-minded politicians, and ordinary citizens who had been helped by his interventions. This network provided him with early warning of threats against his life and helped him evade the assassins who were sent to kill him. More importantly, Ezra had trained other craftsmen in his rope-making techniques, creating a network of rope makers who could continue his work even if he was captured or killed. These apprentices operated in mining camps, cattle towns, and railroad communities throughout the West, using Ezra's methods to save innocent lives and expose corruption wherever they found it. The most challenging case of Ezra's career came in 1875, when he was asked to intervene in the execution of a man named Samuel Torres, who had been convicted of murder in Arizona Territory under circumstances that strongly suggested judicial corruption. Torres was scheduled to be hanged in Tombstone, a notorious mining town where violence and corruption were endemic, and where Ezra's previous interventions had made him a target of the local criminal establishment. The Torres case was complicated by the fact that multiple competing criminal organizations were involved in the conspiracy that had led to his conviction. Torres had been working as an informant for federal law enforcement, gathering evidence about illegal mining operations, smuggling networks, and systematic extortion schemes that were being operated by several different criminal groups. His execution had been orchestrated by these organizations working together to eliminate a common threat to their operations. But the criminals controlling Tombstone had learned from Ezra's previous interventions, and they had taken precautions to prevent him from sabotaging Torres' execution. They had imported their own rope maker from back east, a man who had no knowledge of Ezra's techniques, and who could be trusted to create a noose that would function exactly as intended. They had also posted guards around the execution site and implemented security measures designed to prevent anyone from tampering with the equipment that would be used for the hanging. Ezra's response to these challenges demonstrated the full extent of his ingenuity and the sophistication of the network he had built to support his activities. Rather than trying to replace the imported rope with one of his own creations, he focused on gathering and disseminating the evidence that Torres had collected about criminal activities in Arizona Territory. Working with his network of allies, Ezra orchestrated a coordinated information campaign that began on the morning of Torres' scheduled execution. As crowds gathered to witness the hanging, they found themselves being handed pamphlets that contained detailed documentation of the criminal conspiracy that had led to Torres' conviction. The information in these pamphlets was so comprehensive and convincing that many spectators began to question whether they were about to witness the execution of an innocent man. But Ezra's most dramatic intervention came at the moment when Torres was standing on the gallows with the imported rope around his neck. Instead of sabotaging the rope itself, Ezra had arranged for the information that Torres had gathered to be read aloud to the crowd by a federal marshal who had been secretly investigating criminal activities in Tombstone. As the marshal revealed the extent of the corruption and criminal conspiracy that had pervaded Arizona territory, the crowd's mood shifted from bloodthirsty anticipation to outraged demand for justice. The execution was halted while federal authorities arrested several of the officials who had been involved in Torres' conviction, and Torres himself was released and placed in protective custody until he could testify in federal court. The Tombstone intervention marked the height of Ezra's effectiveness as a fighter of frontier corruption, but it also made him more enemies than he could easily manage. Criminal organizations throughout the Western Territories began to view him as an existential threat to their operations, and they started coordinating their efforts to eliminate him and destroy the network he had built. The crisis came to a head in 1876, when Ezra learned that a coalition of corrupt officials and criminal organizations had placed a substantial bounty on his head and were actively hunting him throughout Colorado Territory. They had also begun targeting his allies and apprentices, hoping to destroy his network and prevent him from continuing his rope-based interventions. Faced with the choice between abandoning his work and putting innocent people at risk, Ezra made the decision that would define the final chapter of his career. He would make one last dramatic intervention that would expose the full extent of frontier corruption while ensuring that his techniques and network could survive even if he didn't. The opportunity came when Ezra learned about the planned execution of 3 men in Denver who had been convicted of crimes that were clearly the result of a conspiracy involving territorial officials, federal appointees, and business interests that extended far beyond Colorado. The 3 condemned men, a newspaper editor, a federal investigator, and a reform politician, had been gathering evidence of systematic corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Their execution was scheduled for July 4th, 1876, as part of a public celebration that was intended to demonstrate the territory's commitment to law and order during the centennial year of American independence. But Ezra realized that the executions were actually designed to eliminate the last 3 people who possessed evidence that could expose a criminal conspiracy involving dozens of officials and business leaders throughout the Western Territories. Ezra's response to this challenge was the most ambitious and sophisticated intervention of his career. Instead of simply sabotaging 3 individual ropes, he orchestrated a coordinated operation that would expose the conspiracy while providing protection for everyone who had been working to fight corruption in Colorado Territory. The plan began with Ezra creating 3 special ropes that contained not just the mechanical modifications needed to save the condemned men's lives, but also comprehensive documentation of the criminal conspiracy that had led to their convictions. Each rope was embedded with detailed information about specific crimes, the identities of criminals and corrupt officials, and evidence that could be used to build federal cases against the entire network. But Ezra's plan went far beyond simply saving 3 lives and providing evidence of corruption. He had arranged for coordinated actions throughout Colorado Territory that would occur simultaneously with the failed executions in Denver. His network of allies would simultaneously release information about corruption in dozens of communities, present evidence to federal authorities in multiple jurisdictions, and provide protection for witnesses and informants who had been gathering evidence of criminal activities. The execution that was scheduled for July 4th, 1876, became instead the most spectacular exposure of frontier corruption in American history. As the 3 ropes unraveled and released their embedded information, federal agents moved simultaneously throughout Colorado territory to arrest corrupt officials and criminal conspirators. The evidence that Ezra had woven into his ropes was so comprehensive and detailed that prosecutors were able to build cases against more than 60 individuals within a matter of days. But the success of the operation came at a terrible personal cost for Ezra. The exposure of such a vast criminal conspiracy made him the most wanted man in the Western Territories, with bounties on his head that attracted professional killers from across the country. More tragically, several of his apprentices and allies were killed in retaliation for their roles in exposing the corruption, and Ezra was forced to take responsibility for their deaths. The aftermath of a July 4th intervention marked the end of Ezra's active career as a rope maker and corruption fighter. The network he had built continued to operate, but he was forced to disappear from public view and assume a false identity to avoid the assassins who were hunting him. For the remaining years of his life, he lived as a recluse in the remote mountains of Colorado, using his skills to help individual fugitives and witnesses who needed protection, but no longer attempting the large-scale interventions that had defined his earlier career. Ezra Whitman died in 1889 at the age of 50, found in his mountain cabin with his hands still holding the tools of his trade. The last rope he had been working on was unfinished, but it contained a coded message that revealed the location of a hidden cache of evidence about frontier corruption that had never been fully exposed. This final gift to the cause of justice led to several additional prosecutions and helped bring closure to families whose loved ones had been victims of criminal conspiracies. The techniques that Ezra had developed for weaving salvation into rope continued to be used by his apprentices and their successors for decades after his death. The network he had established evolved into a more conventional organization that worked with federal law enforcement to investigate and prosecute corruption, but the core principle remained the same. Ordinary craftsmen and citizens could fight injustice through ingenuity, courage, and a willingness to use their skills in service of something greater than themselves. The ropes that Ezra had created were eventually displayed in museums throughout the Western Territories as examples of the ingenuity and dedication that had helped bring law and order to the frontier. But perhaps the most fitting memorial to his legacy was the fact that public executions became much less common in the years following his interventions, as territorial governments implemented new procedures for ensuring the fairness and accuracy of capital punishment cases. Modern historians who have studied Ezra's techniques have marveled at the sophistication of his rope-making innovations and the effectiveness of his information encoding systems. His methods influenced the development of more advanced communication and evidence preservation techniques that were later used by law enforcement agencies and intelligence organizations. The principle of using everyday objects to carry hidden messages became a standard technique in covert operations throughout the world. But perhaps Ezra's greatest achievement was demonstrating that individual citizens could fight back against systematic corruption and injustice, even when they were facing overwhelming odds and powerful enemies. His story became an inspiration to later generations of reformers and activists who worked to expose corruption and protect the rights of innocent people. The rope maker who had woven secrets into every strand had indeed saved more than just condemned men. He had helped save the integrity of the justice system itself by proving that corruption could be defeated through ingenuity, courage, and a willingness to use whatever tools were available to serve the cause of truth and justice. In the end, Ezra Whitman's legacy wasn't measured in the number of lives he had saved or the number of criminals he had exposed, but in the demonstration that ordinary people with extraordinary dedication could change the world by refusing to accept injustice as inevitable. His ropes had been more than just tools for escape. They had been symbols of hope that proved that even the most desperate situations contained possibilities for redemption and justice. The knots that Ezra had tied weren't just mechanical connections between fibers. They were bonds between people who shared a commitment to fighting for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. And the secrets he had woven into every strand weren't just hidden information. They were messages of hope that reminded future generations that justice, like rope, is made stronger through the careful interweaving of individual threads into something that can bear any load and withstand any test. If you enjoyed this incredible, true story of ingenuity triumphing over corruption, subscribe to our channel for more amazing tales of ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things in the American frontier. In the comments below, let us know what you think about Ezra's methods. Was he right to use deception and sabotage to fight injustice? Or should he have worked within the legal system? Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking story of hidden heroism from the untamed West.